All right, welcome to Discord Q&A number 14. I have lots of new questions in the doc, and unfortunately for me, this is going to be my second time recording about half the video because I got about halfway through and realized I had the wrong audio input selected. So I was recording nothing, just me doing, movements and having no sound. So unfortunately, going to be going through some of these early questions again, but well, for me, not for you. For you, it'll be the first time, which is nice for you. So let's talk about question number one, counter items. Do you think niche items designed to counter specific situations should be powerful enough to actually replace one of a champion's core 2 to 3 items, or are they intended to be built later on when some games have already ended? So there's a number of different answers to this question I could give depending on like what we're talking about, right? Do we mean item like counter items like Serpent's Fang? Because that's a totally viable second item purchase for basically every AD assassin in the game. Are we talking about tank defensive items that counter like specific types of damage, like Randuin's? Because that's also a viable second item. Or are we talking about Guardian Angel? Are we talking about Shield Bow? Are we talking about Void Staff? Right? I think there's a lot of different things that people mean when they say counter items. And so I don't have a great way of answering like, well, holistically, counter items are this, because there's a lot of different types of counter items. And class by class, different item systems support different types of counters in different ways, right? Tanks, as an example, a large percentage of their items are actually counter items, right? That's how their class is designed to function, is that tanks as a class are designed to be, their items are designed to be reactive to the enemy composition. You buy your core item and you even have flexibility there. Like you could buy a Sunfire, you could buy a Hollow Radiance, if you're a Sunfire or if you're a Cinder user, or maybe you buy something else, maybe you're Malphite, you buy a Frozen Heart, maybe you're Rammus, you buy a Thornmail, right? Tanks have situational items that are even viable in the first slot, right? With things like the Thornmail and the Frozen Heart for some champions. But even outside of those cases, you can buy a random in second item and it's great. You can buy a Canic Rooker in second and it's great. You can buy a Force of Nature second and it's great against some compositions, right? And so there's a lot of variance here in what a counter item is and what that means between different classes. The reality is some class builds are more linear than others, right? Crit builds, I think, are most linear in that in exchange for having the more multipliers in your build has to be more linear. You don't get as much flexibility as other classes, and you kind of just get told, yeah, you know what, if you ever deviate, you don't get to access these multipliers and you have to pay a big price for that. And that's why you don't see crit 80 carries randomly buying Bloodthirster second very often. It's not very good because you give up on that crit scaling, right? And there's trade-offs everywhere in these item systems. Ultimately, one of the things I'm kind of touching on here that I'll say directly, I've said directly before and I'll still say directly again, it is far, far, far more important for League's item system that your items feel good and that you have core items that feel good for your champion than that you have lots of diversity and lots of choice in your items, right? That's just true, right? The Mythic system has definitively proved that, right? Where it can be good to have counter items in the shop available to you, but we generally do want those for most classes to be later in builds because we want to make sure that your core items feel good for you and are doing the things that your champion needs them to do in order for your champion fantasy to be realized. And so if we need more situational counters or we need a systemic, like let's say, for example, suppose we decided actually 80 carries are too vulnerable to assassins. And we need better counterplay for 80 carries to assassins. The way that we would solve that is likely not by saying, here is a great anti-assassin item that you can buy in the first or second slot, right, for crit 80 carries, right? That's likely not how we would solve that problem. We would instead say, like, actually, should assassins have more incentives to target mages? Should we make it so that 80 carries have more armor per level? Or they have higher base health and they don't scale as well to 18 or whatever, right? Like, there are all sorts of other things we could do, but I think a lot of people make a lot of assumptions about what the item system should and should not do that are kind of off base from reality, where the item system's primary goal, the thing that it is most important for it to accomplish, is to enhance champion fantasies. And it does a lot of other things as well. Don't get me wrong. It absolutely does do other things that are, not related to that goal. Hey, it provides systemic release valves for certain types of mechanics, right? Grievous Wounds lives primarily in the item system. And it's important that we have counterplay to stacking healing, because otherwise, healing can go infinite, right? And that's problematic because that means you can stalemate games, right? or stalemate fights potentially. And so there's good things the item system does that are not that. But everything the item does, or the item system does, should be in service of enhancing champion fantasies first, over anything else. And so the way that I look at this question is I say, I don't think that we need more niche items that are replacing core items. In fact, I do not think that we should be shifting more towards replacing counter items, or sorry, replacing core items with counter items. I think the amount of core items that classes currently have is roughly correct. There might be cases where, hey, actually, I think this class could, be less restrictive in their build, or be less linear in their build paths, or be more flexible in their build paths. Sure, there might be some individual cases where that's the case, but I think across the board, for the most part, I think the current structure on the item system is roughly correct, where tanks have the most flexibility and crit AD carries have the least, and everyone else is somewhere in between. I think that's roughly right. And when I say tanks, by the way, I'm talking in this case about income tanks, not support tanks, right? Because support tank itemization is very different. But that's my thought on this question. So hopefully that is a good, satisfying answer. All right. Is there a reason why Nasus is forced to use his ability to last hit minions? Most infinitely stacking champions in League can gain stacks by either interacting with enemy champions, or they can passively gain stacks by simply existing or CSing. So this is something I've touched on a number of times in the past, but I want to make a clear statement about this. It is good for champions to be unique. It is good for champions to be different. Now, it is not necessarily good for champions to be different for the sake of being different. What are we getting here by Nasus being different from these other champions, or Nasus having a unique stacking mechanism that requires him to use this spell? Well, to me, one of the core parts of Nasus that makes Nasus interesting is, especially in the early lane, you're constantly making value estimations of what is the cost of queuing this CS? What is the value of this, like in terms of what is the cost in terms of mana, what is the cost in terms of health, what is the cost in terms of cooldowns, what happens when I queue this minion, where do I want to position to be in, to potentially queue the next minion, right? That is what makes Nasus actually interesting as a champion to me personally, and I think to a lot of Nasus players. Him needing to queue minions is part of what makes him interesting, and what makes his early laning phase really interesting is that you have this constant on-off gameplay of like, okay, I'm always looking for the next minion to stack. And then when it's on cooldown, you say, okay, I'm leaning back and I have a brief moment of downtime before my Q comes back up, right? Especially like before you hit level 9, you buy a bunch of haste and then it's like, basically up all the time. I think it is valuable to the structure of the way that Nasus plays that he is different in this area. Now, I will also say, from a personal perspective, I think we've over-indexed on champion scaling or champion stacking as a method of, making champions hyper carries. And I think it's actually good that we've moved Smolder away from the hyper carry fantasy. Like, I think the current version of Smolder is much better than the release one, where he is basically just a caster with a mild stacking incentive, but he's not really a hyper carry. He's just like, he scales fine, right? But it's not like, oh my god, it's Smolder at 35 minutes. The game is, the game is over. He's going to kill us all, right? It's like he's just, yeah, he's a good caster 80 carry that scales reasonably, but he's no turbo hyper carry. And so because of that, I think the fact that he stacks on champions doesn't really come with downsides. But Aurelion Sol is a really good example of one where this champion hyper scales, but if you can ever interact with him in a way that's not clearly, like, not a decisive win for you, it's probably wrong to do that, right? Which is very weird for a hyper carry, right? Where it's like, with Kassadin, for example, who scales incredibly hard, if you interact with him and you don't decisively beat him, that's a totally okay interaction, right? With Aurelion Sol, it's not, because interacting in a way that was not a decisive win for you means that you've actually lost because you gave him stacks because you interacted with him, which creates some really weird incentives around interaction and not, like, interaction versus not interacting, or not interacting. Sorry, just, bad at pronouncing. Who knows? Anyway, and I think that for me personally, I actually prefer when we make a hyper carry that we either give them very clear windows of counterplay or like opportunities for those great, decisively favorable trades. Like, this is one of the things that I don't like about the current Aurelion Sol kit is, okay, so suppose you're playing random Mage A and you think you can take a trade on Aurelion Sol that will be roughly even. Okay, well, if you don't kill him and he gets to base before before that health trade is materialized into anything meaningful, you actually shouldn't have done that, right? Like, if you don't think there's a good chance that you turn that health trade, like I trade 200 of my health for 200 of his health, or even 200 of my health for 250 of his health, if you can't actually turn that into a long-term advantage in the future, you actually lost that trade, right? Which I think is very bizarre. Anyway, I'm getting too deep into the Aurelion Soul thing. Talking specifically about Nasus, basically the summary of my thought in that space is I think it is good that Nasus does this, that this gives him a different pattern than the other stacking champions. And it's good to have different options, right? One of the things I often talk about is one of the main advantages of League of Legends as a game, especially having as many champions as it does, is that we can offer very different experiences to different people. And there are people, like myself, for example, that really like that Nasus gameplay that says constantly make these value proposition assessments of going for this farm or that farm or these different things. And it's not to say that there couldn't be a champion like Nasus that just stacks for last hitting, or stacks without spending mana or whatever, right? But the way that I look at it is Nasus provides a very different, very unique experience that is amazing for some players. And that is upside, that is not downside, right? Unifying stacking mechanics has very little upside in and of itself. And so if Nasus is getting value from his stacking mechanism being different, we should let him do that, right? And that's why I think he should stay the way that he is. Okay, why were a lot of epic items nerfed? So this is the 14-19 patch that nerfed most of the legendaries in the game and most of the epic items in the game. The answer is that it was a patch that was from the live pod that was designed to reduce snowballing. That was the goal, the primary goal. There was a secondary goal to reduce complexity in the item system that we've largely kind of gone back on. I think we've kind of said that actually wasn't a good goal. And that's why I was able to make the revert horizon focus, for example, and revert some items, overall complexity up the item system in the current season. But the primary goal was to reduce snowballing, right? We essentially had done a lot of survey data. We said, hey, players think that the game is too snowbally on average. And we did a bunch of data investigation. We found, yep, in fact, actually, it is true. The game is more snowbally. The players are right. It has gotten more snowbally. And so we said, okay, so we know the game is increased. The snowballing is increased in the game. And simultaneously, players are saying they would like the game to be less snowbally. Okay, great. Let's reduce snowballing. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you could reduce snowballing in the game. You could make experience less valuable. You could say all champions get less stats when they level up. Okay, the game will be less snowbally because a level advantage will mean less. You could let players get less gold. You could just say all minions and including jungle camps get 1 less gold per kill. Okay, the game will be less snowbally because when you get a CS lead, it won't mean as much, right? But the method that the live pod chose was to reduce the power level of items, essentially saying each point of gold today is worth less than it was prior to 14-19. Now, was that the perfect way to reduce snowballing? It was not the only way. I think it was a reasonable way of going about it. I don't necessarily think it was for sure optimal, but I don't think it was a bad call to make. My personal take here is that I do think that some of our lower end legendaries and especially a lot of our epics do just kind of feel pretty flat and unexciting now. And so that, in my opinion, is something that is just is something I think we could maybe come up a little bit on. I'm not saying they have to be exactly as powerful as they were before, but imagine a world where, as an example, we split the difference. Maybe we actually do reduce the total gold that you gain by 2% in some method, right? There's lots of different ways we could do that. And then we bring back some of the power on epic items or on legendaries, by 5% efficiency or something like that. That could be very reasonable. But specifically to why does this reduce snowballing, in case anyone's wondering that, it's, well, if your gold if your gold translates less powerfully into stats, right? Like as an example, you get an early kill as Darius and you come back to lane with Darius is not a good example because he built something else, but you get an early kill as, I don't know, Wukong in the jungle and you get back on the map with a tunneler. That is less powerful today than it was for pre-14-19, which means having an early gold advantage is less good, right? And yes, it is true that your opponent, when they do eventually get the tunneler, is also nerfed, but you get to leverage that early advantage less because the gold translates into less power. And this is particularly true on the epic items because the epic items do lead to a lot of snowballing, right? Even small differences in epics can make a lot of difference in how powerful an early lead is. Particularly in the first 10 minutes of the game. epic item power level matters a lot, because the first person to complete an epic item gets a bigger power spike when it's more powerful, right? So ultimately, the way that I would look at this is it was a way to reduce snowballing. I don't necessarily think that it was uh, the most like optimal way to do it, because I think that maybe a mix of different methods might have been nice, so that we didn't have any particular one thing that like stood out and felt bad. I think most players don't really notice this, but there are some players that definitely still feel even today like, oh man, I'm upgrading to a tunneler and I'm not really getting much out of that, and that feels a little bit bad for those players. And I include myself as one of those players for sure. And so I think maybe spreading out some of the some of the snowballing reduction into other areas like XP scaling or gold amount that you gain, maybe that would be a good version of this as well. But that was the ultimate reason why epic items were nerfed. All right, the removal of Kled's takedown courage. This is a topic that's come up a lot. I know a lot of Kled players miss this, and I've said this before, but I think from a gameplay perspective, the incentives on having courage gain on takedown on Kled make a lot of sense. It says, play like a psycho, just the way that Kled is supposed to play, move forwards, always play for kills, right, when you're dismounted, because there's a direct incentive on that. I like the mechanic from a gameplay perspective. The reason why I removed it, and I'm going to keep this brief, is I was given a directive. If I was going to do major work on Kled, I had to, in order to ship the work, definitively show that I had improved the clarity of the playing against experience of Kled. And I tried some other things that did not clearly hit that bar. And ultimately, the only thing that I found that very clearly met that was removing takedown courage, because it is an invisible source of courage. Well, I say invisible. It's a very low visibility source of courage that was often very confusing and very difficult to understand for opponents. Whereas his current courage gain without the takedown courage is all directly tied to an action that he's taking. He's auto-attacking or he's queuing. Those are the ways that he gets courage. And that makes him easier to understand and easier to read from an opposing perspective. And I believed when I did this list that it was correct for me to ship that list. It was a big improvement to the kit. That's what I thought. And I think that the data kind of backs that up, right? He is back to being very similar in pick rate to where he was before he started declining. But I think if your complaint is, yeah, but the gameplay makes a lot of sense and I miss it, it's like, I agree with you, right? I think that that's all true. And I think that if I had art resources when I was working on that project, I would have maybe said, hey, can we get a particle? Can we get something that makes this more visible? But I didn't have those resources. And so I thought, I can ship this list and make big improvements with a trade-off, or I can try to wait potentially potentially 6 months or more, potentially a year or more before I can get free art. I can get a freed up like spare cycles art resource to get me something that might not even be good enough, right? Because the reality is, I could have tried a particle. I don't know if that would have been good enough on its own to definitively prove that he was more that he was more clear, more understandable to play against. And so a lot of this just comes down to the design direction at the time was, if we're working on really low clarity champions, they need to be improved. That might not always be the case in the future. And from a personal perspective, this is something I would love to bring back in the future if I could ever get a particle for it that would work, or if I ever got the opportunity to shift power around in ways that would make this make sense. I would love to do it at some point. And so I'm not going to keep going on this because I could talk about Kled for a long time, of course. But I look at this and I say, I think that I was right to ship the changes that I did, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that they were perfect, right? There are obviously things that could have been better. I had limited amount of time, limited amount of resources, right? I had nothing except my own time to work with. I had no art resources, no engineering resources, and I did what I could to make the champion better, and I believe the champion is better. He is not perfect. Okay. Morgana mid lane. Talking about attack range increase, weaker early black shield, and better rank scaling. So I'm going to give a quick note here before I get into this. Is number one, if you really want to hear a more in-depth take on this topic, a more well-considered take, I would recommend trying to find August streaming and talk to him about it, because he has a lot of strong thoughts. He is the guy who, he's the designer who did the the gameplay side of the Morgana visual update, which was very little change. And we did try some other stuff, to be clear, right? It's not like he just said, I'm not doing anything here. We're just going to ship as is. We tried a number of other things. But I think these specific suggestions are things that stand out to me as things that often come up that I do not believe that more like the actual core Morgana audience actually wants. Attack range is something that requires power, and more importantly, I think it requires attention and action input. And part of what makes Morgana interesting and different from the other, other mage slash enchanter style champions, or like mage enchanter hybrids, which is really what she is that she doesn't have incentive to auto attack much in lane. She doesn't have incentive to be acting very much in lane. She has a very slow, low cadence pattern. And that's good for her that she's different from those other champions. If we gave her 150 attack range and made her more like Janna, more like Lulu, where you're being asked to auto attack more in lane, especially in support, I consider that a negative. She is now more like those other champions in ways that probably aren't good for her core audience, right? This again goes back to some of the things like what I was talking about with like Nasus, for example, is like making her more similar to other champions is not upside, right? Particularly if the way in which she's different is something that her players actually want and appreciate, right? And in this case, I think that is true. I think that Morgana players don't actually want to auto attack their lane opponents a lot in lane, or feel like there's a lot of, like they need to be auto attacking, right? Like that's part of the upside of Morgana. And another thing here that I'll point out is like the weaker early Black Shield and better rank scaling is like, this is telling you to max Black Shield first or second, and that's also not what Morgana support players want to do, right? Similarly to the Lux question that I answered in, I think that was number 13 or number 12, we've tested versions of these champions before where they have these their supportive outputs get more played up, and they're asked to invest more into them. And the actual answer, very definitively from these players, is even if that is the factually most powerful thing to do, we don't want to do that, right? We pick these champions because they have splash supportive outputs, but they get to feel like a mage or feel like a catcher, or whatever terminology you want to use for Morgana's class, in the support role in a way that feels good for them. And so I'm not really inclined to look very positively on either of these things for Morgana specifically, because these are some things that we've considered, some things that we've tested even in the past on similar champions or even on Morgana herself internally. And the end result was, this is not good for the current Morgana audience. And so I look at this and I say, okay, so if we want to support Morgana's audience, we don't want to do these things. And unless you have a compelling pitch for, here is a way we're going to simultaneously make Morgana better for her current core audience in the support role and also do these things, I'm not really compelled by any of the things here specifically. And so this is just something I want to note, is that this comes up a lot, especially from people who think they might want to play Morgana but don't currently play Morgana. It's like, oh, well, if she had more auto attack range, I'd play her. And it's like, yeah, sure, you might. That might even be true, right? Like that could be the case. But if we give her more auto attack range, we have to pull power away from the things that the current Morgana players love, and that is doing a disservice to them in a way that I think is just wrong for the champion. All right. Times when other designers came up with elegant ideas you wouldn't have thought of. So I think all of the examples that come to my mind immediately, like right off the bat, are Stashu, who's a designer who's around for a long time. He still works at Riot, just doesn't work on League these days. But he's a designer who made like a bunch of champions. He made the Fiora VGU. He did most of Gwen, Kiana, did the later parts of Aphelios, did a lot of champion work, did a lot of systems work, did a lot of work on the equivalents of the live pod, right, like balance as well. And I think there's two really like sharp examples, and I think I've talked about both of these before in Q&As that come to my mind immediately, that I would, when he showed off the list, I was like, that is so clever. I would have never thought of that. Number one was the Gnar transforms more, right? Like he gains more rage and his tired debuff is lower time. So he just transforms a lot more, and he is less coordination skewed because it's easier to get into Mega Gnar in any given fight. and you get punished less for like mistiming your transformations and stuff like that. It was very cool and ended up being really, really fun. And I would love to experiment with that more in the future because I think it was just fun enough that I would love to, see more of what that looked like. We had to scrap it at the time because we were just looking for a short-term pro nerf and not like reshaping the champion. We just didn't have the time to work on something like that. But something I would really love to explore more in the future is really, I think, a really, really interesting, really elegant idea of what if Nar just transformed a lot more and stayed in each form less, like for less time at any given time. And then the other one I think of is the Alawi base MS change. This was something that I think I talked about this in a previous Q&A, although I don't remember. Maybe it was on stream. Who knows? But Stashu actually fought really strongly for, hey, Alawi should have a much higher base MS than she used to. You can look back in her patch note history. She at one point just got her base MS buffed by 10, which is crazy. For most champions, that would be an enormous amount of power, right? Like depending on the champ, that's probably anywhere from like 2 to 4% win rate for most champs. For Alawi, it was much less than that, right? She's probably the worst user of base MS in the game. And the point that he made, which was really clever at the time, was like, look, this champion uses MS really badly, right? Like base MS in particular, because what's she going to do if she roams to your lane? Nothing. What's she going to do if she's faster than you and she outruns you? Nothing, because she's in combat. She has to spend most of her time in cast times, right? And so it's like, okay, so she's so bad at using base MS, she should feel better about walking around the map. It's not even going to be powerful. And he was absolutely 100% right. It was not powerful to give her 10 base MS. And it just made her feel better. And that was actually one of the things I think that contributed, not massively, but one of the things that contributed to her being a lot more popular over time was the way that we tuned her. I think actually led to her feeling a lot better over time, comparatively to the release version, which was very unpopular comparatively to versions of Alawi in the past couple of years that have actually been like top 10 top laners in terms of pick rate. There are plenty of other examples, I will say, of other designers coming up with elegant ideas I wouldn't have thought of. Not ones that easily come to my mind, but like I think of like some of the things that AzuBK did in terms of like item balance over the years, or some of the things that like way back in the day that like Soul Crush did for his champion designs. I think a lot of designers have done some really clever stuff over the years, and there's definitely some cool ones. Yeah, I don't want to get too in depth on this question because nothing aside from the Stashu stuff that I was talking about, nothing like immediately snaps into my mind is like, oh my god, that was so cool. It was so amazing when when that came up, because probably partially because at this point a lot of the really, really clever, like, oh my god, that's mind-blowing type stuff happened in the first couple of years I worked at Riot. And after that I maybe I'm just jaded, but as I kind of felt like, oh, I've already seen everything. I've already seen all of this stuff being done, and so a lot of that stuff is just from so many years ago that it's hard for me to remember back to that. All right. Champions that use summoner spells in unique ways, kit references, or interactions with summoner spells. So Zoe does have this, where using a summoner spell triggers her W, right? But I do think this is something that's cool. We've experimented with it a few times over the years, right? Like there's been a few champion designs where we say, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this champion had a unique summoner that only they could use? It's like sometimes when we're just looking for like, hey, we want a really like low cadence effect that's really good for this champion. Sometimes like some champion designs have had this in like the items system, for example. There was a time when we were testing like one of the really, really early versions of the champion that would eventually become Silas. Actually, the passive on that champion was just you get a stopwatch effectively that just that doesn't break. It just has a, I don't remember what the cooldown was. It's probably like 2 minutes or something, but that was the champion's passive. And that was also something we talked about. Actually, should this be, you could take Zanya's summoner spell or something like that. We've tested cool stuff like that before. Actually, more recently, someone was testing, I think it was a Misery, or maybe it was Yellow, I don't remember. Someone was testing hey, what if, and when I say more recently, I mean like 2 years ago, but that is a lot more recent than when we made Silas, let's say that. But yeah, someone was testing what if this champion has a unique summoner spell that only they get to take. I wouldn't be surprised if we do something in this space at some point, or like a champion that triggers something off of summoner spells like Zoe is totally plausible. I will say one thing that I think is less likely, not impossible, but not that likely, is I think it's unlikely we'll do a champion that upgrades your summoner spells. It's like, oh, you get better unique outputs per summoner. Because if we did that, we'd want to do that systemically speaking, where we don't want to have to maintain an entire system for one champion, right? This is one of the problems that the original Ornn ran into back in the day when he had like special items that were only buildable when he was in the game, that were like upgrades to existing items. Was like, the maintenance of that system was a nightmare, right? And that's part of the reason why we built out this piece of tech that lets us, dynamically upgrade the stats on items that is now used, by me to, add stats to your Rod of Ages and stuff like that. But having like very extensive systems for one singular champion is just not really worth it. I think we've found over the years, it's just the maintenance costs of these are just too high whenever we want to change that system. So upgrading your summoners, I think if we wanted to do that, we would need a system to do that. And it's something we've talked about before. Like, what if we had like an objective reward that upgrades one of your summoners or whatever? It's like a really cool pitch, right? It's like this, it's like that could be awesome. But unique interactions, I think, definitely on the table, and definitely I could see this champion has a unique summoner, or this champion has 2 unique summoners or whatever, or this champion has their own version of the summoners. I will say, like, upgrading the summoners I think is pretty unlikely, just because we probably wouldn't want to try to maintain that unless it was a core part of the game in some other way. But yeah, I think that the idea here is totally compelling, or like totally reasonable, totally something that could happen. And it's something we test from time to time. It's just we haven't happened to ship one of these, right? It's not a matter of, oh, we don't do this because of A, B, or C. It's we just haven't done it because we haven't hit on the right kit that uses these. Not necessarily that it couldn't be done. All right. Thoughts on Akali current state? High E damage makes her feel binary. Can't kill without E. Could power be moved into Q/passive? So this is a dangerous one, where Akali has a kit problem, right? Where she is supposed to be an assassin. However, her core pattern is a fighter pattern and not an assassin pattern, right? Her Q passive loop, and to be honest, also her W, all of those are much more conducive to a fighter pattern than an assassin pattern, right? Her E and her R are the most assassin-y spells on her kit, and conveniently, her E is also the only spell on her kit that actually has real gameplay. Unfortunately, RE means that the gameplay isn't there a lot of the time, but at least it usually has gameplay. And so the risks with more passive or more power in Q passive are not just that Akali has lower gameplay and that there's less that you can actually do to counterplay Akali in the moment, which is obviously rough for a number of reasons, because she has a lot of abilities to get to you, and a lot of abilities to secure kills on you, etc. But it's not just about the gameplay, but also that it actually shifts her class, essentially, like more towards having this repeated pattern that she can execute over and over and over again, for sustained damage. And not only is Akali just more frustrating as a champion in top lane, but she's also much, much, much more difficult for us to tune when she's more fighter-like, because her kit doesn't really have good levers for us to tune her team fighting, especially as a fighter, and her scaling throughout the game. It's very hard for us to do that when her Q and her passive are carrying a lot of the weight of her kit. Now, none of this stuff is to say that we couldn't shift a little damage around, right? I'm talking about this in sort of general terms, but it's like, imagine a world where it's like, maybe we could take 10 damage off of E and give her 3 damage on her passive or something, and maybe that feels good. I suspect it probably that's probably not a big enough shift to do something like that, but maybe minor shifts here are okay, where we don't run into difficult territory around like shifting actually her play pattern too much towards a fighter pattern, or shifting her pattern too far away from assassin. But these are just all risks that I'm noting here. And I think the reality is, unfortunately for Akali, her kit structure doesn't really allow for us to have the levers that we need in order to give her the right amount of gameplay on her assassin pattern without loading a ton of damage into E. And that's just a flaw of the structure of her kit, I would say, is that she doesn't have good levers for her assassin damage. She doesn't have a good place to put assassin damage on her kit besides E. And I tend to agree with you that it's like, yeah, of course you're going to feel binary when your E is so much of the damage of your kit. If you miss your E, you're like literally traveling away from your target, right? And it's a long cooldown spell that you don't have a lot of other ways of killing with. Now, there are lots of ways I think we could address this. Like, we could reshape the kit again. We've done that a few times in order to try and address this. But I will say Akali works as she is now. And so I think there would probably internally be a lot of reluctance to make super significant changes when it's like, okay, look, people are pretty clearly happy to play this version of Akali, who is very firmly in this assassin territory. And could there be improvements? Is there room for improvement? 100%. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But I would say that there's a lot of risk in changing this champion, much more so than a lot of other champions, where there's a lot of things that can go wrong with this champion. And so I don't want to present this as if it's like, oh, there's, so much potential for upsides. Like there is, right? But it also comes with a lot of potential for downsides on this champion. This champion is very dangerous to change, very dangerous to shift power around because of the way that her kit is structured and the way that her kit is lacking in, a lot of gameplay that we would actually want from an assassin with this level of mobility. So don't really have what I would consider to be like a satisfying answer to that question. Just wanted to kind of go over my thoughts immediately reading on that. Current state of Imperial Mandate and Shurelya's, and if there's ever been talk about reintroducing/adding similar effects to older removed items like Hextech, GLP/Everfrost, and Twin Shadows. So let's separate this into two questions about the current state of Imperial Mandate and Shurelya's. I look at these items fairly differently. I look at Imperial Mandate and I say, I do not think this item is in a good state. It's basically a Nami only item. I think like Zillion and Renata buy it sometimes, but it's mostly just Nami. Like she's like the only champion that actually buys it in most of her games. And the idea of the item, like the concept for the space, I think makes a lot of sense, even still holds up today of this is the offensive enchanter item for when you want to be more aggressive and less about just supporting your team in a, amplify their output way, but you specifically want to support your team in an offensive way. That space makes sense, but the way that Imperial Mandate actually works, not only is it so hardbound to Nami, like the way that it's structured just makes it like the Nami item, but the output is also just like this boring damage proc that I don't think is particularly compelling for the enchanters either. And so I don't really like the current state of Mandate. I think it could benefit from some significant changes, like maybe even a full rework to something else that more clearly works for the aggressive enchanter space. Shurelya's, on the other hand, I think maybe it's a little underpowered, but I think it at least does the thing that it's supposed to do, which is, hey, this provides a burst of mobility for your whole team. That works, right? It is factually pretty good in some games, and you can often tell, was this cast good? Was this cast bad? Yeah, you can tell, right? A lot of the time. And so I look at Shurelya's and I say, okay, this item performs the function of the space that it's supposed to be in, but the reason why people don't buy it, I think, is because we have these really hefty other first items like Moonstone, for example, for most of the the hardcore actual healing and shielding enchanters, right? I'm talking about like the non-Zillion, like non-Renata champions, like the Lulus and the Karmas and the Jannas and all that. They're making maybe the trade-off for going Shurelya's is a little bit too big, where you're giving up too much of the multipliers on your output, right? Maybe we need to change the build path to something that works a little bit better to support those, support like Lulu buying Shurelya's, right? I could see that. But when I look at these two items, I say Mandate, I would be very supportive of if someone said hey, I want to rework Mandate, I'd say, absolutely, be my guest. Get to it. Let's see what you got. If someone told me they wanted to rework Shurelya's, I'd be like, well, I mean, I feel like it works. Can't you just make some smaller changes and get into a better state? I don't think it's in a perfect state right now, but I think partially the fault of that fault comes from, I think we've made the other enchanter items very, how do I put this? Mandatory isn't the right word, but maybe a little bit too weighty in terms of multiplying your kit outputs. I think the other enchanter items are maybe a bit too multiplicative. And so therefore, when you don't go for those items and you buy the Shurelya's, it feels like the trade-off is too sharp at 1 and 2 items. Because your kit it doesn't get multiplied by your items nearly enough. That's my perspective on those two. Now, on the other side, older removed items like GLP/Everfrost and Twin Shadows, we talk about old stuff all the time. I don't think I will tell you straight up, I think no chance on Everfrost unless it's a very different item. Not that active, I think is, I mean, I try not to say never, and I say this a lot, but it's things would have to change a lot, I think, for Everfrost to be a real consideration. GLP is one where I look at it and I say, I get people thinking about it, thinking fondly back to it of haha, funny snow hose item. That was cool. That was fun when I bought it sometimes. It's Okay, but the item actually wasn't really bought. Even when it was quite powerful, people did not buy the item very much. It was actually not that, like, not used by very many, like, well, first of all, it wasn't used by almost any champions. And even in its heyday, when it was at its most powerful with Glacial Augment, very few players actually wanted to buy the item. That most players would much rather have just bought Ludens, and just bought damage. And so I'm pretty skeptical on the GLP thing. Twin Shadows, I think, space wise, makes a lot of sense. Like the space of Twin Shadows, like the idea of a scouting tool. And of course, the theming is really cool. Like, oh, I send out my spooky ghosts and they go find people for me. Awesome. I think there's a lot of cool things about Twin Shadows. And so, of these three items, I think the most compelling one to me is Twin Shadows. But I think we need to answer a bunch of questions about how Twin Shadows is supposed to work, and like what it's actually supposed to be doing in the game, and like why is that thing powerful, and why do people want to buy it. It's like there's a lot of questions that I think are sort of like not resolved about that if we were ever wanting to re-add it, because that's the reasons why we're at it is like, okay, so when is this item supposed to be better than other support items? What is this item supposed to be good at besides scouting? Because that's not like, it's a powerful output, but it's not enough on its own a lot of the time. And when are you supposed to use this versus not use it, right? Like when the active is up, because you can use it literally at any time, right? It's like it can potentially be providing value. And so I think there's a bunch of questions that would need to be answered. But I do think the Twin Shadows upside is clear. It's like, this is a very cool item in my opinion. I actually quite liked it myself. But unfortunately, just the reality of these items is that they all individually had their issues, and in order to re-add them, I think either the game needed to change significantly, especially in the case of like Everfrost or GLP, or the items themselves would need to change into a way that makes them make more sense and answer some of the questions that we have for items that we, when we're adding them to the game today. So that is my answer to that. Okay. Why does tank damage not scale with current HP? And then it's being like, helps to differentiate them from fighters and gives incentive to hit them. So I think if you think this one through, it should be pretty clear why this is not something we want on the tank class as a whole. It is because as a tank, you should feel good about taking damage that would have otherwise went into your team. You should not feel bad about that, right? We don't want tanks to feel bad about taking damage. In a world where, imagine a world where you're playing Scion and you feel like you don't like, and you feel like there's strong incentives for you to not frontline for your team so that you are personally more powerful. That is a really perverse incentive to have in the game, especially for a whole class. Now, one thing I will say is that could we have a champion like this, like a tank that's like this, or an item that has this incentive? Yeah, sure. I think that's totally reasonable if it's more of a, this is something that happens occasionally, but not something that happens for the whole class. I would not want to introduce a strong incentive for tanks to not take damage, to avoid, like for tanks to be avoiding taking damage. That is not just because you took the damage, right? It's like, I think it is good that Scion wants to stand in front of the Ezreal queue for his AD carry. I think it is good that Ornn feels good about standing in the front of his team and maybe taking some extra poke, because that means that his team can walk up behind him and he's creating space for them, right? It's like the incentive and the structure for a champion, or like for a tank to take damage, kind of requires for the structure of the game that they need to not feel terrible about taking damage. And in a world where we tell them actually your outputs are lower if you take damage, I would be very concerned that we have just made tanks feel worse, like significantly worse about doing the thing that they should be doing, in exchange for maybe some light structural like positives. And I'm not even sure that they would really be that positive, right? Like the idea that you're not incentivized for hitting tanks is really weird to me, because like, yeah, you're just like auto attack the tank, you get, it's free damage, right? Like, I don't know, to me, I don't actually think there needs to be incentive to hit tanks. And like, we already have that, right? And I don't think that tanks need super differentiation from fighters. I think they are already pretty distinct. Could they be more distinct, and could we have more incentive to hit tanks? Sure, right? I'm not saying that either of those things would be like bad to add to the game, but these are not things I look at and say like, oh man, these are critical problems we need to solve. We definitely need better differentiation between fighters and tanks or anything. It's like, I don't look at it and say that, right? I think that these are things that could be nice, but not things that we should pay a hefty cost for. And I think that tank damage scaling with current HP would be a massive cost to pay. Like I think it would be quite bad for the tanks themselves. It would just make them feel worse to the point where I don't think we could ever really consider it. And so I am going to move on from that. So, how would you redesign the support upgrades? I'm not going to actually answer this question. I just wanted to leave this here because I'm going to talk about sort of the underlying principles here. I'm not going to actually say like, oh, I would do A or B or whatever, because that's not what we're here for. I'm just going to talk about some of the interesting thoughts that I have about this space of like, so I think structurally the idea of like, here is the enchanter option. Here is an aggressive like that's Dreammaker. Here's an aggressive option, which is Blood Song. And then here's the mage option, which is Zazak's Realm Spike, is okay, right? I will say that I think there are other structures that could make sense and could maybe even be better, right? Like as an example, a structure that I've proposed before is, what if one of the core outputs of the support class was that you had an aura and you got to pick what your aura does, right? And so one of the outputs of the support class is you get to choose which kind of team buff that your team gets to this game. And maybe it's not even an aura. Maybe it's not even near you. Maybe it's just like a global buff. You get to choose that, and that's part of the support's job, is that they're the one who needs to pick which global buff your team gets or whatever. It's like that kind of thing. I think is a really interesting. I'm not saying that would actually be good, but it's like I think thought experiment wise, it's really interesting to think about. The goal when the current support upgrade system was made was to increase support satisfaction, which by the way didn't work. It was not effective at this, but and so I think it made sense for them to say, we are going to give you outputs that feel like they are made for your champion, right? And so that was, something that made sense at the time. But I think given that the changes for that, for season 14 didn't actually increase support satisfaction in any way that we could measure, indicates that that was not a successful, like that was not necessarily a successful, or not necessarily a fruitful path, is I guess what I'll say, or not necessarily a good goal to have. Or sorry, not a good goal. Of course, it's a good goal to increase support satisfaction. It was not a good pathway to accomplishing that goal. There we go. That's a good way of putting it. And so I would be thinking about like, what are other positives? Like, what are other upsides that we could get in the support roll upgrade? Because I think it's cool that you have an item that you get to choose, different upgrades for. And to me, if we're going to do that, it makes a lot of sense if we do that in a way that is something that not just the support, but potentially even their teammates could feel good about, right? And so that's where I get into thinking about like, okay, what if this is something that, lets you combine really well with your allies, or lets you scale particular allies really well, or whatever. Again, not necessarily saying it would be good, but if I were to redesign the support items inside of the existing system, like saying like, okay, we're going to preserve, there's an enchanter option, there's a mage option, there's, an aggressive option. The key things I would note are like, the enchanter option is 100% invisible. It's like almost impossible to tell what Dreammaker is ever doing. And that would be something I would, like to improve. Having a visible output that you can feel good about as an enchanter would be nice. The Zazax is like, I don't think it should actually just be a damage proc. I think that that's actually not really what we want mage supports to have access to. There's good reason why we've nerfed Zazax like, I don't know, like 5 times or something. We nerfed it a lot over the years, where having a damage proc, especially that you can stack with other damage procs because you're kind of getting it for free, causes some problems in and of itself, which I'm not a super big fan of. And so, yeah, I think I like trying to find a mage item, a mage upgrade that is not, here is my, Luden's proc, essentially. Like that's basically what it is. It's just like another Luden's proc. That would be what I would be thinking about. And for Slay, I think it's mostly, hey, how can I find a way to make this more satisfying? Honestly, Slay maybe is just fine. And for Celestial Opposition, I would be thinking, okay, if we actually want a defensive support output, like something that helps you live, how can we make this something that's actually satisfying and doesn't require, blindingly bright and massive VFX to be playing on everyone's screen that can see the support at all times, but would actually be like satisfying and you could actually tell what it was doing for you. Like, say Malphite passive, right? Obviously we put Malphite passive in a lot of areas, right? It's on the Jungle Pet, it's on the Mountain Soul, but Malphite passive is good, and there's a reason why it's, we've copied it a number of times. It's just a really nice passive, to be honest. So Yeah. Uh, that's kind of my answer to this one is just, like I said, I'm not going to tell you like, because a lot of what I would actually do depends on why am I doing it? Like, what are my actual goals for redesigning the support? Is it just make the current existing system better, or am I overhauling the support upgrade system and trying to make it the best version of a support upgrade system possible? There's different versions of a rework, so I can't really give you a solid answer to that question. But hopefully, this has given you some insight to like how I think about that space. How much sample size is needed to see if rune/item is actually strong but unpopular? It depends on what you're talking about. I would say I would want to start with like 10,000 games. 1,000 is like a good stepping stone. But if it's different champions, that becomes a lot harder to read. But like 1,000 games on a single champion is a good place to start. In general, sample sizes can be pretty complicated in League, is because it's like, oh, 1,000 games, but distributed over 6 months worth of patches might not actually be accurate anymore, right? Because things might have, like, systemic factors might have changed between those, and this data might not actually be comparable, right? Conversely, like, oh, here's 5,000 games from one champion, 5,000 games from another, so that we can add up to 10,000 games. That might not be a great sample either. So a lot of it's just going to depend on the kind of work that you're doing, like how precise you need to be. So I don't have a super great answer here, because also, by the way, I'm not a data scientist. I mean, I do have a degree in mathematics, I guess, but that's not statistics. So I guess I can kind of claim ignorance here. Well, a little bit. Obviously, I do some of this work on a daily basis. But my general take would be, if I wanted to make serious claims, like very strong claims about the data, I'd want 10,000 roughly. If I wanted to get a general sort of inkling, or like a general notion of like whether something is statistically anomalous comparatively to its compatriots, I would say probably about 1,000 is where you want to start. But I wouldn't consider 1,000 to be super reliable in terms of like, oh, this is definitively much better than this, or much worse than this, or equal in power to this kind of deal. Okay, in Pro Play Fearless Draft, do they need bans anymore? This is an interesting one, and I'm definitely not the like expert on this topic, but I will say that the argument for this is largely like, oh, pocket picks are really cool, and so having giving Froggen the ability to play a Nivea, or whatever, insert your more modern counter pick, or sorry, not counter pick, pocket pick type of situation is like, yeah, I think that's fair to say that it is exciting to see players' pocket picks come out, and like having it be worth it to invest a lot of time in playing one champion. That's cool, and I think that's fair. However, I do think the bans do a lot of really good things for the game. Number one is, honestly, it just means that we don't have to balance the game exclusively around pro in order for pro play to like not explode when we have one or two champions that are really, really off for pro specifically. Because the reality is, a lot of times we have a champion who's off in solo queue, we can just hotfix them or whatever, but it's often a lot more difficult to fix a champion who's really off in pro play. Like really, really not really over or under tuned or whatever for pros specifically. And so having bans is a nice safety net of, hey, look, you think that Cassante is the most unbelievably overpowered thing on this patch? Great, you have bans. You can just ban him on red side if you want. Bans also, I think, add a lot of context and interest to the way that compositions get formed, right? In a banless world, you are going to much more frequently, even in Fearless, you're much more frequently going to see compositions being, this is the 5 champions that we wanted, or this is the 5 champions that fill out the best version of this comp, or this is 4 of the best version, especially game one's like, here are 4 champions that fill out the best version of the 1-3-1 comp. And well, the last champion is our second or third string champion because they picked the best one, or the second best one, or whatever. Like they weren't available, or our top laner doesn't play the the best version of this or whatever, right? And so I think it's actually bad for both comp interest and comp flexibility if we don't have bans. I think there's a lot of negative outcomes to no bans. I actually think bans end up being pretty good. Now, I'm not necessarily saying the number of bans is right. I do think that there are cool things we could do, of like, imagine a world where you go, one ban on each side, and then it's first pick, and then there's another round of bans. It's like two bans, and then you get to pick, right, or stuff like that. Or maybe the pick and ban phase shouldn't be the same from game to game, and actually in game one, both teams get to pick one champion before bans, and then that's not true in game two. It's like, I think there's all sorts of things, like alternate versions of it, where you could have opportunities for pros to pick champions without being banned. But I think the idea of removing bans entirely sounds pretty clearly wrong to me. Like, it just seems like bans have too much upside, but it doesn't necessarily mean that bans have to be exactly structured the way that they are right now, like, or that there's even the right number of them, right? So I think that's kind of my conclusion here after thinking about this very briefly. And I will tell you straight up, there are other designers who actually like have done work on draft in the past that probably would have a better idea of sort of the foundational principles here and might have a better conclusion than me. But as a game designer thinking about it briefly, my conclusion is I think getting rid of bans is almost certainly wrong, but that doesn't necessarily mean we couldn't potentially provide avenues where pocket picks and things like that, like where bans aren't necessarily the the thing that's stopping you from picking your I don't know, general sniper Riven or whatever, right? Stuff like that. All right. Could Kraken Slayer be reworked into a Zeal item? Well, we can do anything. So yes. Actual answer here is that I actually tried this. I talked about previously that I did some other versions of the crit system for Season 16. And I haven't gone into detail on these previously, which I probably will never do. Unless I release one of them, I guess, in the future, if we actually decide to do one of them. But anyway, one of the versions of the 80 carry, 80 carry, this was a version of the system where I was redoing crit and on hit first items. I did actually have Kraken Slayer as a Zeal item, and I think it worked okay. I think it was totally fine. Some people really liked it. Some people didn't like it as much, but I think it functioned just fine as long as I put the appropriate incentives on it. Like I had that version scaled with the damage scaled with crit, so it was like, oh, of course, I buy the second, it scales my damage. I do think it infringes a little bit upon Phantom Dancer's space, where Phantom Dancer is like, this one has the most stats, therefore I'm the one that gives you the most damage. And then Kraken Slayer says like, oh, by the way, I have Zeal stats, but also I give you damage. So it's like, when are you supposed to buy PD versus Kraken Slayer? Unless Kraken Slayer is like, oh, you're planning on like mixing on hits and crits, which by the way is cool. I think that we could potentially have more interplay between the systems, and so maybe that's actually upside, but that's not for the purpose of this question. Basically, the way that I think about this is Kraken Slayer actually makes, I think, a really good first item. It has really satisfying, noticeable effects, and it also has a lot of upsides around like its cadence and rewarding, continuous combat that are good on first item. I think it has a lot of really positive things for first items, for the first item slot. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't have a good version of it that is a cool, Zeal second item. My personal preference would be, I think that most systems are better, probably, or like our systems are probably better on average if Kraken Slayer is a first item, because I think it just makes a good first item. But I think that there's versions of the first item slot where we say, actually, we don't want Kraken Slayer here, and therefore it needs to be a second item, and I think that's totally reasonable. Zeal is fine if we want to make it like, as long as we have the incentives in the right spot and we make the damage like scale with crit or something like that, or can crit or something along those lines, I think it's all totally fine. Or we have other support for that interplay. So ultimately, this one is, could it? Yes. Do I think it's likely? No, but I don't think it's impossible either. I just think it's most likely to stay as a first item, which means it's not a Zeal item. This one's a really easy question to answer. How is it balanced that Smolder gains permanent Elder Dragon buff after he gets to a requisite number of stacks? The answer is because numbers exist, and the value of their execute is not the same. Executes are not all created equal, right? Like they just have numbers on them. And so Smolder's execute is a lot smaller than Elder execute. And, make this comparison here is like, if I told you that I was going to give Garen a buff, and then Garen is now going to execute you when you were at 1% max health, it's like, okay, who cares, right? Like that doesn't really do much of anything, right? How often does it do something? I mean, it is factually, it's some power. It's a very small amount of power. It's essentially equivalent to about 1% more damage, which is, I mean, it's not nothing, but it's not much either, right? And conversely, what if I told you that I was going to give Garen a 99% execute? If he deals, if he hits you and you're below 99%, if you're below, if you've lost more than 1% of your health, you're dead. It's like, well, that's obviously ridiculous. He'll just instantly one tap anyone that he touches, right? So there are a lot of numbers between 1 and 99, it turns out. And I believe it's called the intermediate value theorem. It's been a while since I got my mathematics degree, but I believe that that's the right one. And that's the actual answer to this question, is that Elder Dragon has a much higher number and is intended to end the game. Smolder originally was intended to be a hyper carry. He still gets to have his execute, which is factually like, it's a good bit of power on him, but it's not like it means that he is inevitable or that he is unfair in any way. And if we needed to, we could always change the number, like the percentage number on his execute. And in fact, we've done that before because it was too good at one point, right? And we've nerfed it, right? And so That's just a very easy question to answer in that uh, numbers are numbers. Some numbers are higher than other numbers. Some numbers are lower than other numbers. And you can change numbers to do what you want. All right. Ashe passive. How does turning her crits into a flat percent extra damage contribute to her champion fantasy? What is the story / reasoning, etc. behind it? And is it functioning as desired? So the goal here, this was done before my time, but I believe that the goal here, from what I understand, was Ashe was intended to be definitively the utility carry. And they wanted her to still deal damage, of course, but it was intended that she would scale crit a little bit differently from other champions, where she would actually get more utility as she built crit, which is why her slow can crit. And so the idea was that on Ashe, all of your builds would do some amount of damage, but the crit build would actually scale very differently than other crit builds, and it would scale your utility, which was, I think, a really interesting and compelling pitch. And I think that structure largely works. I will say, I kind of wish that we slightly nerfed her. Like, if we wanted this actually to be more real, I think what we could do is nerf her baseline slow slightly, or maybe the scaling on it or something, and make the crit slows more impactful, or say crit slows aren't just double up front, they're triple up front or something like that, and the decay is sharper or something. Basically something to make it more clear when she is buying crit versus not, and when she is critting you versus not. But I think largely the gameplay of this actually works the way that we want it to. And so that is my understanding of how this works, or how this was all intended. But I could be off, right? Again, this is before my time. This Ashe passive was made before I was there, so I can't necessarily speak to that. Maybe if you catch August streaming, you could ask him and see if he has any particularly valuable insights about that process, because he was there. So that's the answer I can give you here. Is it's to make her scale differently with crit than other champions, but still let her deal a lot of damage as an AD carry. And I think it largely works, but it's not super visible, so maybe we could punch that up a little bit. All right. I don't actually know how long this has been, but I think this has been about an hour, because I cut this into 2 parts, so I can't really tell. But I think this is going to be the last one I answer for now. And if it's not long enough, if it's not at least an hour, I'll come back and answer another question or something, because I'm getting really hungry and I want to eat. So, why does the on-hit system serve both champions who rely on strong on-hit effects and champions who scale with attack speed, instead of having separate mechanics for both? So the answer is that this isn't really true. There are a bunch of champions that scale really well with attack speed that buy crit, right? Like, say, Jinx, for example. Or, I don't know, Sivir, or, I don't know, who's another good example? I don't know. But, there's a lot of crit champions that build crit and don't build on hit, right? The answer here is also just that on hits are essentially they essentially give you an attack speed ratio, right, on your kit. And so, of course, on hits are going to synergize with other forms of attack speed ratios, right? Like champions that scale well with attack speed, essentially you're saying this champion either has an attack speed ratio or has something that functions like an attack speed ratio. Do you know what functions like an attack speed ratio? On hits, right? Vayne Silverbolts essentially says when you buy attack speed, Silverbolts deals more damage per second because you're applying them more, right? And so it's well, of course, these things have these systems have natural synergy, in that if you want a lot of attack speed, of course you're going to share stuff with the on-hit champions, right? This would be this is the equivalent of saying, or looking at why do caster ADCs and crit ADCs share a lot of items? Caster ADCs want to deal damage with their abilities, and crit ADCs want to deal damage with their attacks. And it's okay, sure. I mean, even beyond the part, look at Smolder, for example, who really doesn't auto-attack much. It's okay, but they scale with the same things, right? Smolder Q scales with crit. And of course, Smolder does build different items, and there's been, versions of Smolder where he built more or less crit than currently, right? But they scale with the same types of effects. I guess that example I gave was kind of bad, so let's just pretend that didn't happen. But they scale with, essentially they're scaling with the same kinds of things, or the same, one of their scalings is acting like the other type of scaling. And so I'm not really seeing the argument for why these should be completely separate systems. What's the goal here? The other question I have is why, what's the benefit to having separate systems? Because the champions that scale with attack speed, they're going to buy a lot of attack speed, which means that getting on hits is going to be good on them anyway, right? And so like imagine a world where we separate out these items and suddenly we say, okay, here are a bunch of items that have 60% attack speed on them, and then here are the on hit items that have less, but they offer you on hits. It's like, well, all the champions that buy on hits and scale with attack speed are going to buy a mix of those items anyway. These systems have to be interrelated. They have to be overlapping, unless we gave them some like really linearly scaling things that you couldn't bridge or you couldn't leverage if you were buying the other one, which I don't even know how we would do that. But it's kind of like I answer this question basically as, well, because they have to be the same systems. They're overlapping the same incentives. It's like, why do here's a better example. It's like, well, Rengar auto attacks a lot and Talon mostly deals damage with his spells. Why do they both want lethality? It's like, well, they're dealing physical damage and they're trying to burst you, so they both buy lethality. Why do you think that they should have separate systems? Do you think that we should have an auto attack assassin set and a caster assassin set? It's like they both want the same thing. So I definitely don't get the thrust of the question here, but I thought it was worth talking about because basically it's just on hits essentially add an attack speed ratio to your kit. If you already have an attack speed ratio on your kit, whether that's an on hit or not, you're going to want to buy a lot of the same items as the champions buying the on hits and the champions buying a lot of attack speed. And that's where we're at. So anyway, I'm going to go eat or maybe not if I don't have enough time. So thank you for watching and catch you in number 15.